is Andrea Richardson, and welcome to the Fresh Perspectives in Social Work podcast. Last episode, we were talking with Dr. Elizabeth Wynter around the concept of youth engagement. She is the author of Follow the Love, which is a fantastic book around this concept of scaffolding. But we were talking in our last episode around kind of the history around engagement. How did that work in the social work and child welfare system? What was really the youth reality and kind of what their experience has been? And we touched on some research and practice models that kind of have revolutionized and kind of brought us to the point here where we are today. Still not where we want to be, but better than where we were before. We're going to jump right in and start talking about, how we can acknowledge sort of where state and local practices are. We're trying to figure out how to engage and build relationships because we know that it's important, but it's complicated and there's lots of red tape. We had talked about, some of the liability kind of pieces, and that always sort of drives like what we do because, agencies don't want to be sued and have to go to court. But is that the right thing? And can we kind of figure out other ways to make that work? So where we have, lots of kids who are leaving care each year, where do we know that they're going? Where are they going, Dr. Wynter?
Sadly, some are going to the streets, which is the sad part, and knowing that some of these young people have experienced homelessness in their lifetime, that homelessness isn't that far of a stretch, which is really a sad statement. And many of them are going back to their relatives and biological families. Some of them are going to some supportive housing programs. Thank you. Some of them are being able to get the FYI voucher, which has not been an easy process, right? But the question is are they ready? And that, to me, is something that we really need to think about. Have we done enough to prepare them? And we're going to know which young people are going to age out. It's not a surprise, right? Mm-hmm. So we need to, better prepare. I don't think, I have to laugh sometimes when I hear like life skills. Life skills are good to have, but better to have a village of people that you can borrow money from, that you can get a ride from, that you can get some advice from. And so I just think that, we need to really drill down on, how we're caring for young people and the importance. I'm so excited that Soul Family looks like it's going to pass. The bill's going to pass in Kansas, and that's a relational permanency initiative. I just think the more tools that we can use, right? We have tools that we can use to find young people's connections, to support those relationships, I think the better off we'll be. And as far as really changing, like the systems change that needs to happen, which I believe really needs to be intentional. But we need to look at what's the power dynamics, and are we willing to share power? And I think that's a question that we really need to think about because, my approach to all my work has always been twofold. One is everything I do is going to be based on research. And by the way, anyone who wants to see research or read research about transitioning youth, Chapin Hall is amazing. They have done the Cal Youth Study. They've done the Midwest evaluation. So they're sort of the primary folks that are doing the research on this. But we also have to integrate lived experience voices. You mentioned those that what is amazing to me is that young people who have aged out of care have such grace that they want to come back and help us improve the system. There are more and more lived experience folks working now in the system than I think ever before, which is a great sign of change and things to come. My fear is, are we ready to have them in the workplace with us.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think we are. I think we've got to do more so that we don't scare them off or make statements that are insulting to those with lived experience. I think we have to shift our language. But I'm excited because the more young people that come in care, the more young people's voices we're going to hear, and hopefully that will bring change. But I do think we have to find a way to stay in proximity and right relationship with young people, and they have so much valuable information to share with us if we'll allow that.
Yeah, and for folks that don't know about the Soul Family legislation in Kansas, can you tell us a little bit more about what that's all about?
Yeah, what they're trying to do, and Casey Family Programs is or NEAKC is behind it, but it is the fourth permanency option, right? So right now we have adoption or guardianship or APLA, right? And for those who don't know APLA, it's another planned permanency living arrangement. But it's basically saying we're just going to let them age out of care without attaining permanency. And so this would be a fourth option, and it's a relational permanency option, meaning who am I in relationship with? It doesn't mean placement. I really think once we take placement off the table, then young people will tell you about all kinds of people who they love and who love them. Hence the title of the book, Follow the Love. And so because after working with all of these young people for so many years and hearing them and recognizing those that were doing really well had a supportive adult relationship, right? It was easy to see which ones had a relationship. And so it just is incumbent upon us, again, to support them in developing and strengthening their connections over time.
So let's talk just a little bit more about the scaffolding, permanency connection scaffolding that you're referring to in your book, because I do think that that's a really interesting concept that I think a lot of practitioners can apply when they're working with youth. And I would almost say like youth of any age, you got to build these things up from the beginning, as much as you can. So describe the concept to us so that folks can understand sort of what you're talking about.
Sure. So just like a building, right? As you're building a building or working on a building, right? You put up a scaffold, which is a temporary structure that provides access, right, to all parts of the building. And so in my book, I talk about 4 different elements of a scaffold, and I compare it to the elements of our system, right? And so if we're going to do systems change, we have to do it from, every angle. So in my book, which is really a path forward for agencies who want to become youth-centered, I really believe that, that has to be strategic. So for agencies that want to become youth-centered, it talks about who are the people that should be involved in this conversation. What are the programs? And by programs, I mean, what are some of the trainings? If we want to co-design with young people, we need to first know what that looks like. What is co-design? Well, what does that mean? And how do we share power? And how do we build relations up? And then the next one is, how about policies? There's certain policies that prohibit relationships, right? They don't support it. And so one of the things that I learned in writing the book was we have 12 states in our country that allow young people, teens, to have a say in termination of parental rights. That's amazing. Why can't we do that across the country, right? So that's a policy that could be enacted that could support continuation of relationships. And then the last one really is, what are our practices that need to be addressed in order to shift? One of our practices is rejection and ejection, right? But rejecting a young person from your facility or your foster home, or so not accepting them into your program or ejecting them once they got there, you have to think about how that impacts a young person. Stability is a key element in, and of course, Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? And so I always say, like, we can't dive in and start working on trauma healing before a young person is in a safe, stable placement.
Right.
And most of the time, we know that young people move 5 to 7 times while they're in care. And so is that, so how do we fix that? And so each of these things really needs to be corrected. And so that's how the book talks about. But underneath that, so once I finished writing the book, I decided I realized it needed a prequel. And by that, I mean that while we can focus on, policies and practices, the first things we need to do is focus on how do we change the system. And often that is, how do we change the mental models that are holding this problem in place? And so I think if we fail to do that, if we fail to shift those mental models and fail to really have sharing of power and fail to build relationships and connections with young people, then we won't be successful in this effort, right? And so we need to do it all, and we need to do it with intention.
And I would imagine that, changing kind of the way that we're thinking about engagement, which is basically, a shift in how practice has been done, takes a change in organizational culture and kind of how that's viewed, and really has to be happening from not only the top down but also bottom up. Like, you need people who are at the bottom, who are working with folks and who are champions of that kind of new look at how we do social work in child welfare. Is really important to being able to implement the policies and the legislation and all of that that we talked about before. So what are some of those pieces? Like, if you were to say, hey, you really need to have these critical aspects in place, right, in order for youth empowerment to happen in a today's child welfare practice. And I should say that change should be sustainable, because we have certainly things that are sort of more like, we have this initiative and isn't that great, but then we want kind of that sustainable change. So what do we need to have in place from your perspective that would encourage those things to happen?
Again, I believe youth councils are the foundation for a lot of this work.
Okay.
They're not easy. People think you can just, so you have to have staff that's committed to this. And you need to have, and it's great if you have young people that are peer supports, right, that are working within your system. I think that's awesome. But you're absolutely right. It has to be from top down and bottom up. And so oftentimes there's biases. So I'll give you, for instance, young people have shared with me more than once that case managers don't like bio parents, that they have an animosity or a bias against them. And so what happens is then young people don't feel like they can be honest with their case manager about talking to their family or running away and seeing their family. And so I do believe that we all are going to have to undergo some positive youth development training, some youth engagement training, some co-design. All of that I think is really important, and to do that with your young people, right? And one way I love to do a shifting of mental models is hosting world cafes, right? Or there's different models to do this, but the more time we can spend in proximity to young people, the quicker we will change our perception of who they are. And listening and building just regular relationships. Like, when was the last time you sat and went to lunch with a young person or had coffee or chatted with them? I'm so fortunate because I have some mentees, right, that I'm mentoring, and it is so wonderful for me to get their feedback and hear from them on a regular basis, because it keeps me focused in the right direction, as opposed to like living in that leadership fog that we find ourselves in child welfare. And so the more we can do that, the better we'll be, but it's going to take some time to get from where we are. At the same time, which I think is really wonderful, is we're also reassessing the job of a case manager.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we need to make sure, as we rethink that job, that making family and young person engagement a stronger element of that role, I think is really important. And because young people have told me, some of them, like, they can't stop talking about how great their case manager was and how their case manager changed their life. But that's only a few, right? Many of them have had a stable case manager. But meaningful to young people, that position is really meaningful. And for them to be able to share also, which I love, listening to young people who've aged out, right? They're now looking back in the window as opposed to looking out the window. And so that looking back, they are able to share, which I think is so valuable, that I know I got kicked out of that home. It was my behavior. So they're taking accountability and they're saying, wow, I was really hard on that case manager, but they're going through so much, right? And to understand that and to respond in a trauma responsive way, I think is really important. But that relationship and that honesty, young people oftentimes aren't told the full story. Can you imagine? I mean, not being told you're going to move and get picked up and shipped off to another foster home or group home and not have any idea that's going to happen. So we need to do better. But you're right. I think right now we're in an odd place in child welfare. I don't know which piece needs to come first, but we are in a culture crisis and we need to change our culture.
Yeah, and I think that from like an organizational development or organizational effectiveness perspective, I think what we know is that for an agency to be able to really engage youth, they have to be able to have clarity of those values, beliefs, behaviors, like within their own agency, be able to have good engagement within each other, just in terms of, strengths-based supervision and kind of doing all of that. And then be able to basically do the skills that they're doing, in their own agency with the people that they're working with. So that's kind of where then like training might come in, where you might have, fatherhood engagement training or mother engagement training, youth engagement training, and be able to have kind of those conversations, like you said, like world cafes or luncheon kind of stuff, where you're talking to people who have lived experience, who are coming in and kind of providing that feedback and talking about what worked, what didn't work, and then how do we go ahead and influence how we do things on a day-to-day basis based on the things that we're hearing. So it's hard to say, like, the chicken or the egg comes first kind of thing, but, it's kind of an and. So I think if people who are listening, if you're working in an agency, begin to kind of look at these things to kind of see, okay, where are their holes? Where are there things that we might be able to start with, and start in one spot and then build from there might be a good way to approach it. But anywhere where you can kind of get youth involved, or even, parents that have lived experience involved, to kind of begin to chip away at some of those, impressions that we've had over time, it is very impactful and helpful for sure.
Yeah, and I think the folks that are ready, the agencies that are ready,
right.
And so, I do consulting with agencies to help them become youth-centered organizations, and eventually I do see that this work will feed into their quality assurance work. As we will find things that will let us know where we can see that youth voice was included, that young people were part of this. And so I think if once we start sort of digging in and doing some of the trainings and doing the youth council, and then we can say, okay, these are the practices that demonstrate that you're a youth-centered organization, and let's then follow that to fruition. And then, of course, what is the outcomes that we're looking for? And so ultimately the outcomes are youth are engaged and empowered, right? That they feel that they have a voice in the decisions that impact their lives. And I think that's really, really important. And I think the only way that we shift mental models is to have them with us, right? This is not work we can do on our own. And oftentimes we sort of step forward and say, like, we know it all. But the reality is we don't. Right now, we don't know it all. We can't make assumptions about what works for young people, but we've got them at our fingertips. So why aren't we just asking them?
Right. So I'd imagine that if I'm an agency who doesn't have this practice put into place yet, so I'm not a youth-centric type of agency yet, I might have a strategic plan that begins to get the ball rolling. As I'm finding more youth who might be interested in kind of influencing the system and improving the system that they've been through, I'm then relooking at that plan with youth at the table to say, okay, what kind of changes can we make from that youth perspective to kind of begin to continue to move us forward? So you don't have to have youth at the table at the very start, because you may not even have them identified yet. But from that plan perspective, as soon as you've got some folks who are interested, you're kind of pausing and almost like reintegrating them in for that planning to happen, so that you do get that youth voice, that youth perspective, and you can kind of move forward in that path.
Yeah, I'll give you a for instance. So youth councils, again, are a great way to get this started. And so there was a youth council in Florida that basically said, when we are being presented to a foster parent for placement, you have a face sheet that you provide the foster parents. And the question is, can young people get a face sheet on foster parents? Because they know what's going to work for them, right? And so give them something so that it can help them be part of the decision making. And I just thought that was lovely. And so that's what I'm saying. These young people have amazing ideas that could easily be implemented if we wanted to, again, follow that thread. However that worked for us, it's great for young people to say, wow, we made this change in our system. And we're really proud of that work. I think anytime we can advocate together, I think we're stronger.
Yeah, and chances are, if you're doing kind of that face sheet for foster parents, you probably, and the youth is kind of having that voice in that choice, and keeping in mind that getting foster parents can be a challenge. Finding kin can be a challenge. Like, we're recognizing that there are challenges there that we still, as a system, kind of have to figure out. But that if we're giving youth the opportunity to choose where they're going, they're more apt to buy into where they're going. You're going to have less struggles than if it's we're going to put you here and that's it. Which you or I wouldn't want to have that happen to us. So why are we putting youth in that situation? It almost seems vastly unfair. Yeah. So, you talked a little bit about data, and we know data drives a lot of our practice these days for all of the reasons that, go into funding and all of, the database decision making and all of that. And it is important. We have NIDed data around older, youth in care that has some pieces, but, a lot of folks would say, it's not really hitting the mark. What kinds of other things can people look at to help them figure out, what the effectiveness of their approaches are, what kind of impact that they're having? Obviously, we can ask, we can do surveys, you can just talk to people, talk to youth and get sort of that feedback. But are there pieces of our practice that we know that we already collect that could help us give us a better idea of how we're doing?
Absolutely. So the as I mentioned, the strength and number of connections, I think, is an important element that we ought to be checking. So when I talk about scaffolding connections, young people don't have the wherewithal to sustain relationships while they're in care, right? They don't have the transportation. Sometimes we've taken their cell phone away. And so, and they obviously, someone needs to help coordinate that. And so whether that's the caregiver or the case manager or the independent living specialist at some point, we need to see that. That needs to be part of our job description. And so we need to see that change in order to improve outcomes. The other thing that we ought to be tracking is, again, progress towards self-sufficiency. Are they, I think often we are very patriarchal. Child welfare provides the services and the programs we have, not necessarily the ones that they need. And so I think it would be great, right, to listen and then adjust our programming, because most of our programming, at least in Florida, is based on whether you go to school or not. Well, is that the path for all? And are we expecting all of these young people to graduate from college? Isn't there another pathway, right? And so I know extended foster care, they can be working, but our post-secondary education program that, Chafee pays for, they have to be going to college. Now, the sad part is they're not going to graduate college by the time their program ends. And so where have we put them? Have we put them in a place that they can be successful or not? I just think we need to focus on all of that. We need to make sure that they have a support system as well as have employment experience. And if they're going to college, that they actually have a goal to graduate. I find that many young people are using these programs as entitlement programs and using it so they can pay their rent, not necessarily with a plan to graduate with a degree. And that's sad, because that is 3-4 years of their lives that basically have resulted in nothing, right? And so I don't think that's supportive, and I don't think that's helpful. And so I think we really need to do a better job of helping young people determine, like, what do they want to do? Also, you mentioned about the brain, the adolescent brain. We know the brain isn't fully developed until age 25. And we know the last portion of the brain to develop is the prefrontal cortex, which houses our executive functioning, which requires us to helps us organize and plan and all the things that we need to do in order to know what we're going to do with the rest of our lives. And so I'm a little concerned about how we do transition planning, because a young person isn't like, they can help, they can make some decisions about their life, but to get from where they are now to there, they're really going to need a support system to help them drive that. And they don't know. How do they know? I want to go to college, I want to study this. Someone's got to help them figure out the steps from here to there. And so I just think that we're asking a lot of young people without giving them the support they need to achieve those things. And so I think we need to really engage those supportive adults around that transition plan and determine who's doing what, right, for this, with this young person, to help them achieve those goals.
Yeah, and that makes a lot of sense, Dr. Wynter. I think that a lot of what we see is we kind of have our standard kind of practices. We do try to make them as individualized as possible, depending on what the resources are. But there are clear gaps in our process. And sometimes it is based on a resource, allocation. I mean, that is a reality. But I think that as we're identifying these areas that we have kind of gaps in practice and process when it comes to working with youth, I think then it's then getting that plan put into place as to how are we going to improve that and really working that plan so that we're actually making an impact in a positive way, in a sustainable way. Right. So I want to thank you, Dr. Wynter, for spending some time with us. I think that our discussion here was fantastic. We've have a lot of really good information that will kind of get people started, but I do want to encourage folks to check out Dr. Wynter's book, Follow the Love, Permanency Connection Scaffolding. I think the concept is a really great one, and there's lots of really good information, stories that you can really take. We're going to have a link to that book in our show notes, as well as some of the other tools that we've talked about today and some of the research that we've talked about today to help with kind of getting things going for folks who maybe haven't put their practice into place. And we'll also link to your website as well, Dr. Wynter. So if folks want to get in contact with you, they can go ahead and do that because the skills and experience that you bring to this work, the passion that you have in making the lives of youth successful is really one that needs to be shared and kind of brought out to other programs so that we can continue to make the lives of youth better. So thank you everyone for joining us today. Stay tuned for our next episode coming up.